there were years where I was kind of operating from a paradigm of the grade book as a private closed space, like that it was mine. And it wasn't until really years later that I understood the power of inviting students into the conversation. That I understood the value of clarity of learning, and gosh, like the simple impact of defining and communicating to students where we're headed, and to help them feel like partners in the process. I mean, the whole point here is that students have agency in their own learning. That's empowering, and that's the really like the core shift at play here.
This week on the ML Chat podcast, Tim Blackburn joins us to complete our 4-part series on the formative assessment process. In this episode, Tim recaps the importance of clear intended learning, eliciting evidence, and interpreting evidence as he builds to a discussion to the 4th and final part of the formative assessment process, which is, wait for it, acting on evidence. If you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes, make sure you check those out. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the ML Chat podcast. Hey, everybody. This is Justin. We are welcoming back our good friend, Tim Blackburn. Tim is, as a reminder, is the Title III Administrator for Tigard-Tualatin School District, just outside of Portland, Oregon. And we have been having quite the conversation. This is a lot of fun. Welcome back, Tim.
Oh, thanks, Justin. I'm just happy to be here.
Hey, we're thrilled to have you, and this is going to be a lot of fun. It's been quite the conversation that we've been talking about clear intended learning, and then eliciting evidence, and working through interpreting and analyzing evidence. Do you mind giving us just maybe a quick summary of what we've talked about on our previous conversations, and then maybe give us a quick highlight of what we're getting into today?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So happy to do that. So, in our prior chats, we talked about a 4-part formative assessment process. You'll also see it in the literature referred to as formative assessment practice. But really, what it is, it's a pedagogy. It's a set of considerations that teachers can use to inform their practice. And so it starts with knowing where you're going, having a clear sense of direction. We call it clear intended learning. And the important part about that in terms of serving multilingual students is not just having a sense of direction, your backwards design for what you want students to know in terms of the content. It's also putting a language lens on that content and really defining the language development opportunities, within that learning. Thinking about the academic vocabulary demands, thinking about the forms and the functions of language that students will need to connect their ideas and express their understanding of the content. So this formative assessment process really starts from having a clear sense of direction.
Do you mind?
And then from there,
is that what Hattie's talking about when he's talking about
clarity? Yeah, it's not just, and what Hattie's talking about is not limited to a teacher's sense of where things are headed, but it's also in the ways in which a teacher communicates that direction and helps students. And this is sort of the metacognitive side of it, is help students evaluate formatively where they are in terms of those target skills. So you're absolutely right, Justin, that it is very, very much based on teachers certainly like kind of plotting the map, right? Like where things are headed, but also making sure that we shine a light on the specific skills and the language associated with what we want our students to know and do.
And I guess if we want to build assessment capable learners, having that clarity, having that clear intended learning becomes that much more important, right?
Oh, absolutely. They say that formative assessment is assessment for learning.
Mhm.
And so that's why it's so crucial to have clearly defined outcomes. And so as a teacher, and this is the second part of the formative assessment process, it's referred to as eliciting evidence. And it was understanding language at Stanford that kind of packaged this formative assessment process. And what I learned from my colleagues on understanding language is that in order for me to have a clear sense of what my students know and can do, I have to have language output. That's like the key theme related to eliciting evidence. It's that it's the teacher's opportunity to design these invitations for students to show what they know and can do, and to really like build. And what Aida Walke would say is that students can like apprentice in the target language and the target concepts and the target skills in low stakes and supported ways. And so if I have evidence of that growth, evidence of learning, for what I hear from my students and through their conversations, and what I see in their writing. And I just love the metaphor that Aida Walke uses that's instructive here when she calls it invitations, that students have the space to interact in a in a constructive way. And again, if we're really clear on what we want our students to know and do, then I'm listening for evidence through those conversations. I'm looking specifically at student writing as evidence of that learning. And so once I've designed those interactions on the day to day, is how do I interpret what I hear and what I see in their writing? And that's the third part of the formative assessment process. It's having tools to not only like analyze and interpret student growth, but to also invite students to do the same. Right? Again, yes, going back to the importance of having clearly communicated and clearly defined learning outcomes. And so it's those tools that we spoke about last time in particular that can be so instructive for not only for teachers to communicate growth, but for students to understand their own growth in the target set of skills.
Such a powerful process. And it makes me think a little bit. I have conversations with, with educators all across the country, and we talk about them formatively assessing speaking, for example. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they're kind of, they ask, they pair students together and ask them to talk, and then they're walking around the room and they're trying to listen. And I'm just thinking, golly, that would, I guess, kind of hard to, interpret and analyze the evidence based on students talking in a group by you walking by, and hopefully you heard enough and you were able to gather it, capture it. That seems like there's probably some best practices to capturing that evidence, capturing those speaking artifacts, if you will, writing, whatever it might be, as a part of that formative practice, so you can interpret and analyze it.
Oh, sure. I mean, absolutely. I think of like there's so many different ways in which I've seen teachers creatively not just like create the space for students to interact in a meaningful way, but to then like you said, kind of attend to what students are saying and kind of monitor it. And that's really like the power of group work, to be honest, like of having like meaningful student collaborations, because it's not just like the conversation in the small groups that is illustrative of student learning, but then how that's actually recorded in student work. I like to think about like collaborative dialogues or collaborative posters. Think about illustrations and illustrations of learning, the artifacts of learning. Even additionally, there's also there's really neat tools out there. Like Seesaw is a really great example of a ways in which I've seen, teachers make, like pains to create the space for students to talk in a meaningful way and then to record that information too. And another way that I saw a beautiful lesson last school year. Every single student in the classroom talked in some sort of authentic and meaningful way. And it was just a brilliant Socratic seminar in an eighth grade English language arts class. And this was not performative. It wasn't perfunctory. What I tell you is that the teacher poured so much into creating like an authentic debate that students were in a very well informed way, unpacking. In this case, it was bullying. The issue of bullying in their school. So it had kind of an SEL sort of component, social emotional learning component, and it was just language rich. And to see the students having this dialogue in an informed way, actually like listening to one another with purpose and responding with data, it was so cool, so cool. But I think it serves as sort of a helpful example of how a teacher would not only create the space to interact, but also then to kind of like formatively assess the use of the target language, the target skills, and the concepts.
And I love that idea of inviting them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And giving them a chance to apprentice. That's really cool. Okay,
Yeah.
so so we've walked through this process, and now it's time to
Mm-hmm.
talk about how to act on that evidence, on those artifacts that
That's
you
right.
gather, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that a manila folder is where data goes to die. Well, like it's kind of a dramatic metaphor. Tell me, I mean that I know that's a saying that you've used. Tell me a little bit about that. Unpack
Uh-huh.
that for me.
Sure. You've done all this hard work in your lesson design, right? You were clear with your learning intentions. You've elicited evidence by like really looking for language output as illustrations of student learning or evidence of the learning. You've used rubrics that are fine-tuned to call out those class concepts and the target skills and the target language. So now what are you going to do with that information? And you're right about that example that that the data can grow stale. It could be irrelevant. It might not even be like connected to your target concepts and your target skills. So it, not everything has to be like when you close your eyes and picture student data, it doesn't have to be all spreadsheets and numbers, but rather what evidence do you have of student learning? And then what are you going to do tomorrow to support students in building their confidence and their competence in the target skills? For serving multilingual students, that could be, I'm noticing that this particular student didn't yet quite have the independence to show me evidence of learning on a particular writing task. So maybe I need to provide a differentiated support in the form of like a word bank or signal words to serve as sentence stems. That is, we can use that information really as a tool, Justin, for differentiation.
And it's interesting. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the metaphor I feel like I've heard you use recently about data being a constellation, for our students, and really,
Mm.
or trying to get a constellation of data points, not just the one data point or the data that's on a spreadsheet and goes in that manila folder. And so kind of maybe talk a little bit about that constellation idea and how we can use that data to actually act on it and use it to inform our practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from an uncomfortable truth, and and certainly in the multilingual student field is almost by rule, like we're overly reliant on our summative English language proficiency measures. And so, yeah, you're right. I harp on this quite a bit because I want to live in a world where students aren't judged on their performance on one test, on one day.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is we can do better and we have to do better. Our students deserve better,
Right.
right? And if we know that it's bad practice and yet we we continue to do it. And so Robert Linquan, Margaret Heritage, they have written extensively about this. Basically it's the danger of a single story. And so the constellation of data points, it is not my metaphor. I did not write that. I want to make that abundantly clear. I believe it actually comes from Margaret Heritage and Robert Linquanti. And if I remember correctly, from a really awesome book that they co-wrote with Aida Walke called English Language Learners and the New Standards. It's a really awesome book from 2015. But what I took from that book specifically related to formative assessment is on the daily having conversations with students and really encouraging their reflection on their own growth in our target concepts, in our on the skills that we're developing, and to foster a conversation with my students about growth. And it all starts from reflection, Justin. I mean, it's creating that space and inviting students to be like partners in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about my own practice, there were kind of operating from a paradigm of the grade book as a private closed space. Like that it was mine. And it wasn't until really years later that I understood the power of inviting students into the conversation. That I understood the value of clarity of learning, and gosh, like the simple impact of defining and communicating to students where we're headed, and to help them feel like partners in the process. I mean, the whole point here is that students have agency in their own learning. That's empowering, and that's the really like the core shift at play here. It's moving away from an over reliance on a single data point, and rather inviting students into a process that in a almost like on the daily and like in a routine way, we're talking about growth and we're focusing on evidence of learning and our collective roles. The significant shift here is moving away from reliance on a sole summative measure, right? And inviting students into a process in which they're partners in reflecting on their growth, right? And so my role as teacher is more of like, say, a facilitator, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've helped chart the course in terms of the target skills and the target concepts, and then I can also create the space to encourage students to reflect in an authentic way their own progress.
And so it's interesting. Originally, I figured act on evidence was specifically talking about like the teacher, the educator. But really, as I hear you describe that, it makes me feel like acting on evidence is it's for everybody. It's the student, it's the teacher. Ideally, if we're bringing the family in on the process, it's the teacher, it's the ELD or ENL teacher, it's the classroom teacher. It's getting everybody to work together and act on the evidence that we have, right?
Yeah, and very much in like a metacognitive way.
And so what does that look
And
like?
honestly, like The way I do it, do a lot of reflective writing, Justin. We anchor every lesson in our target skills for that day. We review our agenda for how we're going to get there. But by the end of class, I mean, I want my students to have some space to summarize their learning for their day, to reflect on their learning for the day, and to think about their next steps for unlocking future learning. What will tomorrow look like? And it's that sort of formative feedback that I get from my students, that then just from the teacher part of it, it informs me about the sort of differentiated supports that I need to consider for the following day. It's basically like a conversation of strengths, and then looking for the edge of that growth. And every student in my classroom will have a growth edge, and every one of my students has. And so what does the evidence tell me? What evidence do I have of student learning that informs what tomorrow might look like for that particular student?
I love listening to you kind of talk through that, and it makes me think about how interconnected each of these four pieces really is, right? Because what you're just describing there, as far as the reflective writing and the thinking of what did we learn today, what do we need to learn tomorrow, the students being on the edge of learning, what's their next, it really comes down to having that clear intended learning objective for each student, like what's next, but also what is down that road, what are they working towards. And I'm thinking about being a teacher and having 30 students in my class that I'm working with, working towards this with, or I'm a director and I'm trying to help all of my teachers do this work, and I feel a little overwhelmed at trying to think of being able to put this in place for every single one of my students.
Yeah, and I totally get that. It's not a question of 30 separate lessons, right? And and 30 separate learning targets, but rather, like, for instance, like one way that I really came to rely on it is in grouping. Like, for sure. Like, so if I knew that there were certain strengths in my classroom, or like certain students that were struggling with a particular set of concepts or skills, that really informed the ways in which I group my students for the next day's lesson. So if you think about it in terms of like mixed level grouping versus, say, for the purpose of developing a specific skill, like, yeah, I want to bring those students together so that we can highlight that specific area for growth. It's basically a conversation of not yet. Like, so where are you not yet proficient? Let's pull you together, right? And we're going to focus on this discrete skill so that you can use that skill to unlock future learning. In a really wonderful book called Amplifying the Curriculum, Aida Walke and George Bunch, they refer to that as, quote, generative learning. And that's really resonated with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, over time, as our students apprentice in these skills, it unlocks future learning as students become more independent in our target skills. And I find that, like, really empowering, as a teacher, that it's about the ways in which I facilitate that space, right? I don't have to write 30 different lesson plans, but rather there's a real beauty in using group work and collaborative tasks for students to actually collectively build those skills together.
Thank you for that, for kind of that gives me a lot of hope, because 30 different lesson plans would be a little much. But so then I'm thinking, how do you decide to group your students? And I feel like a lot of times one of the things that we see is in an absence of maybe some, speaking or writing artifacts, some of the,
Mhm.
the evidence that maybe we're hoping that we're gathering, as a part of our eliciting evidence piece, in an absence of maybe data on speaking outside of, our high stakes language assessment results, we end up using like our reading data, right? Like, oh, well, we have an assessment for reading. And so we use that as like a default. And if we do that instead of using actual speaking data for students, what are some of the challenges that will create?
Well, I could think of a few. I mean, firstly, it really comes down to like the purpose behind your grouping, right? And so the kind of grouping that I was, describing before was really like a homogeneous grouping, right? You're grouping students with a like need because you've observed, through your formative assessment that students are not yet proficient or they could use some extra support in a differentiated way on a discrete skill. And so, irrespective of what your iReady data might say, or what sort of what Dibbles tells you, you're you're basing that grouping judgment on the student's needs as evidenced through the day's lesson. On the flip side of that, as far as the value of reading data and speaking data and sort of like it's kind of thinking about this might be helpful, like the clarity and the depth of the snapshot, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you think about it like in terms of like a picture, right? Yeah, when you to what extent does the data reveal like an actual representation of where students are in their language proficiency or in their reading comprehension? Like those data are instructive, they are helpful. And my argument here is that they're not the end all be all, is that your classroom observations are also just as valid, if not more so. We often really like lean into these quantitative representations of what students know and can do in terms of their English literacy. And I've been thinking a lot about like the gaps in that, and like because there are certain assumptions that even by just referring to English language like assessments, that certainly does not reveal to me the strengths and the assets that my students bring to class in terms of their home language literacy or their home language oracy. And that's really what I meant about like having like a having data from like valid data from your observations as teacher in these target skills are going to give you like a full and rich picture, yes, of the student's assets, and yes, of the areas in which they are not yet independent or not yet proficient. And so again, it's like it's not a question of or, right, like
Mm-hmm.
these like qualitative data or quantitative data. It's rather a conversation of and, like how can I complement these data, the quantitative data, with my classroom observations.
Which is powerful. Like as you say that, I'm thinking I love the and in there, qualitative
Mm-hmm.
and quantitative. Because a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
it seems like we default to what we can measure. I had a I had a CEO that I worked with one time that said if you can't count it, it doesn't count. I always disagreed with that personally. He would say that
Yeah,
like I don't know about
I wouldn't mind crossing swords with that. Just
right.
yeah, because I think it discounts the role of a teacher. I mean, to think about the expertise and the empathy. I mean,
Hmm.
we I mean, I think that in a lot of ways that's very disempowering, right? If we're to solely rely on what we can count, right? And so again, it's, for me, if we're going to have a conversation about student growth, we need to have like a fuller picture that accounts for what students know and can do. Yes, yes, in English language reading, yes, great, but
Mhm.
there's more there's more out there, right? Especially in considering a student's home language skills.
And so when you're thinking about acting on evidence, I mean, it's really
Mm-hmm.
it's not just it's not just me, using what I've observed, as we elicited evidence and then, kind of interpreting it and analyzing it and trying to figure out what's next for this student or this group of students and how I want to group my students to talk about it. It's really, it's a lot more, there's a lot more dimension to it than just necessarily how I'm going to respond next in my classroom.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think sort of implicit there is that you don't have to do it alone either, and that there's real value in coming together, with colleagues to talk and like share observations. So when you work through these cycles, the formative assessment cycle process, and you're analyzing and interpreting evidence, think about how powerful that would be. Doing so with partners, with my teacher peers, and then pulling on that is like, how can we develop like common supports that might be like shared routines or grouping strategies that emerge as a result of our conversation, as a result of our collective analysis. It's teaching can be like a really isolating thing, and so again, the formative assessment process can actually assign sort of like a meta language for a pedagogy, a responsive pedagogy, and designing culturally and linguistically responsive, tasks and tools that just create the space for students to show us what they know and can do.
That is so good. And so do you have any last thoughts maybe on this whole process that maybe, kind of wrap this up for us if you don't mind and
Yeah.
help us catch the vision of how we get moving on this?
Yeah. So there's a few things that come to mind. I mean, the process, like NC, like the process, altogether is really designed to be like totally agnostic of a particular content area, but it does assume something really important. Well, a few important things actually. Is firstly is there are language development opportunities throughout a student's school day, and so by starting from clear intended learning, the layers there are three at least, right? It's having a clear understanding of the target concepts, having a focus on those Bloomsy verbs, right? The thinking practices, and really building student independence in higher order thinking practices like evaluating and analyzing and interpreting, synthesizing, summarizing. And finally, implicit in the in analysis, for instance, is a language load. What is the language development opportunity for analyzing a cause and effect relationship? Well, the formative assessment process kind of gives us a tool for unpacking those demands, and again, it's so important that we do that with our colleagues, that we're highlighting these clear intended learning outcomes together, and extending that is, with my colleagues is thinking about the invitations, thinking about, creating the space for students to grow in those skills, in those target skills over time. And I just love the metaphor of invitation, right? And apprenticeship, and thinking about, in kind of a spiraling way, how we can design these invitations for students to grow in these skills over time. And then, from there is equipping students with the skills to monitor their own growth, and equipping myself with the tools for analyzing and interpreting student growth in those target skills. And, the more I think about this, the more I'm convinced that teachers coming together in a professional learning community to actually home in on that growth is so important, because the impact of that is so direct into thinking about the future supports and actual differentiated supports for students tomorrow and the next day. That is what emerges from those conversations is generative, because it's designed to equip students with the tools they need to unlock future learning.
And I think that's why we see leadership playing such an important role in student achievement, right? Is because our best leaders do such a great job of getting their teachers, their building that collective teacher efficacy, that group, bonding people together, working together, creating a common language, putting out that North Star of what we're working towards, and getting everyone to row together. And I think that's what is, I'm kind of thinking about as you kind of describe that and think about that, or kind of talk through that, I guess, is that it, oftentimes that's why we see achievement. We know that it's the importance of the teacher in the classroom or the teacher with the students, but collectively as a group for that school, leadership matters.
It really does. And when I think about my warmest memories and experiences as a teacher, we're serving on an interdisciplinary team at International Community High School. And when I think about probably for me, the most crucial leadership move, from my dear former principal, Barina Cabarcas, is that she trusted us. She said, "These are your 90 children, and I need you to see them through." she totally trusted us to, with, the charge of making sure that we're holding our students to a high, grade level standard, that, despite the fact that they're, recently arrived, newcomer multilingual children, they're also ninth graders, right? Yep. And so we had to come together to find a way to simultaneously, build their readiness in terms of, grade level content and grade level skills, and equipping them with the language they need for success within each of our disciplines. That wasn't just a question of what Mr. Tim did in class, but rather what we were doing collectively, as a teacher team. And, as you shared, Justin, for me, the big leadership moves was the trust in, from our school leader to do the job.
Is that the same principle that gave you the bus analogy or metaphor about
different principle?
Oh, that was a different principle. Okay.
Different principle.
Well,
yeah, Mr. Boss said that.
Yeah, you've got to walk us through, tell us that, and then we can kind of wrap
same
up with that.
Same sort of thing I was just referring to, Richard Boss. This is back when I was at the Fordham Leadership Academy for Business and Technology. And what Mr. Boss said was, I want you to imagine that there's 30 children get on the bus with you at the start of the year. What are you going to do to make sure that those same 30 children are with you at the end of the year? Well, it's just like a helpful metaphor, it's like you can't drive like a maniac, screaming down the highway, the bus, bouncing up and down and losing children along the way. For me, it was like a very instructive sort of visual, like, okay, they're my responsibility. I accept that, right? I accept that challenge. And I think what I learned, though, along the way, that it's not just about me, but rather what my colleagues and I can do together to ensure that those same children arrive safely and better for it.
And better for it. And you know what? We've all been better for being able to spend this time with you, Tim, and kind of walking through this 4-step formative practice process and model, and really appreciate you doing that. I know that you're going to continue to be here on the ML Chat podcast, so people can continue to tune in to find you here. But tell us, if our listeners want to go find you, somewhere else online, where can they go to follow you or connect with you, Tim?
Oh, that's a really good question. I do have a Twitter handle that I never use. Would that be helpful?
I think it's helpful. Let's throw it out there, and maybe this will be the beginning of a big Twitter following. Let's go.
Yeah, you can find me at Blackburn. I love language, so I made my own verb. So I turned my last name into a verb. So you can reach me at Blackburninated. I'm on LinkedIn as well, at Tim Blackburn. And then, of course, you can find me in the Tiger Tualatin School District. And be happy to. You can reach me at my emails on the website, actually, over tsdschools.org.
Yep. If people want it, they can go hunt it down and go find you and connect with you that way. Well, Tim, what a pleasure. This has been incredibly valuable for all of us, and we look forward to figuring out how we can really take these learnings of clear intended learning outcomes, kind of starting with that, and then working through eliciting evidence and interpreting it, analyzing it, and then lastly acting on it, not just in the classroom, but as our teacher groups and as a learning group to meet the needs of our students, our multilingual learners. And anyways, this has been amazing, Tim. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
All right, we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
All right, later on, Justin. Thanks, everyone.